My staff is getting old. It does not work the way it used to. I try to cast my fireball, but all that erupts from my staff now is just smoke. I must surge through this forest and construct a new staff with vigor and girth.
Hello folks, and welcome to Dice Chatter. My name is Donnie, and today I will show you how I made some gnarly dead trees that you can use in your tabletop games. Whether it is Age of Sigmar, Dungeons & Dragons, or Frostgrave, you can always find some good use for old and dilapidated trees. So without further ado, let's get to the whiteboard. The overall idea is pretty simple here. Get some thin aluminum wire, twist it up into a tree armature, and cover the thing in some glue. This will make everything very sturdy and durable. Of course, after that, we will plop it on a base, throw some texture on the trunk and limbs to act as bark, and finish it up by painting it to a tabletop quality. Now, let's hop on over to the build. To start off, you need to wrangle up some aluminum wire. Make sure you get aluminum so your weak little hands can twist the damn stuff. I would also suggest getting some wire that is quite thin. I went for 3mm and 1mm wire. It is nice to have some variety as well, so we can correlate that into smaller branches leading off the tree trunk. Then you take your wire, cut it up into segments. Depending how big you want the tree, that depends on the length of your wire. For each of these 4 trees, I made 8 strips of wire. The smallest tree was 6 inches, then 8, 10, and 12 inches for the largest one. After you have made up a handful of wire strips, then you can start building up your armatures. Now there is some science to deciding where to twist your wire and continue it up into another large branch on the tree. Some mature trees don't even have a first branch until 10 or 15 feet up the tree, while others split off into segments right at the Earth's surface. For my larger trees, I went with the idea and thought of a dead cottonwood or an American elm that shoots up to the sky. For the smaller guys, I figured I would try to build up some sort of thick crabapple tree of sorts. Once you have built up your armatures with the thicker aluminum wire, it is time to start adding in the thinner wire to add in more branches and thinner details. Using the 1mm wire, I created extra segments that popped off at the end of larger branches, and also some that were a combination of an already created branch. The idea here is to create as many extra segments that is reasonable. On real trees, there can be lots and lots of different breaking points, expansions, thin branches, thick branches. But when making a simple tree for the tabletop, you have to realize it isn't going to be perfect, and I found that lots and lots of branches can become a big hassle during the painting process. So I created trees with a fair amount of branches. Enough at least that I could easily get a brush in to paint and also still look like a gnarly tree. So after a bunch of twists and turns, your trees should look something like this. After this, we need to add some texture over the armature, and aluminum foil in this case will do the trick. The overall idea of the foil is to give these trees some girth and plump them up. And also just to hide the fact that it is just a bunch of wires as well. I learned while doing this process that you need to create multiple layers over the trunk of the tree and fewer over the branches. Just imagine your typical tree being thicker at the base and thinning out as the branches make their way up to the sky. Another thing to note while my footage speeds ahead here is the fact that the foil has a hard time adhering to the armature. It isn't so bad that you cannot work with the material and get it to do what you want, but if you have a hot glue gun around and you just dab a tiny bit of glue behind a section of foil you have to pin down, it should do the trick. Take your time during this step and make things look good and proper. The foil step is probably one of the most important because we are going to use the foil creases and cuts as some of our bark texture as well. Once you have that complete, we'll move on over to the next part of the build, putting these trees on a base. For the base, I use peel and stick vinyl tiles. I have gone over this process in my past couple terrain videos, so if you are interested in how I did this, I'll link one up in the corner now. On the tiles, I just simply draw out where the trees will be located and then cut it out. Once I've cut everything out, I use my hot glue gun to attach the trees to the base, and also use some excess of the hot glue to create any roots that are sticking out of the ground. Creating roots with a hot glue gun is super simple and easy, and in these finish shots right here, you can see how I created the roots. It may be a little hard to see since the glue is clear, but you will get a nice view near the end of the video. Now on over to the next step. After finishing the build, I don't know if this step was necessary, so I will cover it briefly. The idea was to take a lot of Mod Podge and cover it over the entire build. The plan was to smooth out a little bit of the stark aluminum foil texture and adhere the foil to the armature. This did the job at the end of the day, but the foil still didn't exactly work perfectly as I wanted with the Mod Podge. If I was making these trees again, I would probably pass this step up, but I still wanted to show you folks the entire process. Nonetheless, I slopped some Mod Podge over the 4 trees I was working on, and things were at least a lot easier to work with as we moved on over to the bark texture step. For the bark, I wanted it to be super simple and easy. I got a lot of glue, some play sand mix, and put it all together. I then took this slurry and spread it all over the trees. Not going to lie, I was a little nervous on how this was going to turn out because in some areas it didn't look fantastic. I guess this was the looks like crap part of the build and I just needed to get past it. I will say though, if you have some larger pebbles or stones mixed into this slurry mix, make sure to keep these rocks off the trees or at least shove them into gaps of the armature that seem too dull or bland. A series of larger pebbles can act as an odd texture on a relatively smooth tree. Just take your time with this step, and as the mix dries on the armature, we can start tackling the base. To create a simple and basic texture on the base, I just used some Vallejo thick mud paste. This stuff goes on super easy and dries fantastically. I honestly don't add anything else to the base at this point and let everything settle overnight, so that in the morning, I can quickly prime everything black and get started painting. First off, I do want to apologize for my airbrush station filming setup. It is a tight squeeze in this section of my basement, so these are the best angles I can show you folks. With that out of the way, for most of the base coating process, I use the airbrush and am consciously deciding what colors are going over each tree. The thing with dead trees is they really do vary in different colors and shades. I decided to go with an overall gray theme with some light brown and yellow mixed in. If I just painted these trees in a single solid color, they would look pretty basic, and even adding just one accent color may not make them pop on the tabletop. I find it is always a good idea to have a handful of colors or shades for each terrain project you are doing. Adding a variety of color can make a boring build become a solid one. The 3 main colors I used on the trees were Army Painter brand Uniform Gray, Moondust, and Monster Brown. I also added in a brown ink as well in some of the lower sections of the tree just to give it even more interest. After a handful of minutes hiding in the back corner of my basement, we eventually have some decent looking trees. Before we start getting into more highlights, I wanted to give each tree a nice coating of a black wash. And then after dumping a lot of wash on the first tree, I tried out a new little tactic of washing each tree but then soaking up the excess in a paper towel. Now this still left the wash in some of those deep recesses, but it did not allow the wash to soak in some of the higher areas of the build, desaturating the trees, which I find sometimes can be the case. After taking some time for the wash to dry, I went back over some select spots of all the trees with those initial 3 colors. I took out my favorite dry brushes, the dollar store makeup brush, and went to town on the trees. I wanted these dead trees to still be dark and grungy, but they still needed a boost of color from the dry brushing to give them more depth. I took my time with this step and gave these dead trees the pop that they needed. We are getting into the home stretch here, folks. Next, we need to give the bases the final touches. Since I mainly will be using these trees for the tabletop game Frostgrave, I decided to go with my usual frosty theme base. But I also didn't want to go overboard with the frostiness so that I could still use these trees for any other theme. I did a little dry brushing of gray to white for starters, and then just added a little snow texture sporadically over the bases to finish things off. Now I did not do this for these trees, but feel free to add some grass texture, some tufts, mushrooms, or anything else you can think of for the setting of your games. Alright, the last thing here. I wanted to add a little swing for one of the trees. I snagged up a very thin spool of string I had lying around in the hobby bin and peeled it apart to even get a thinner rope. I took this thin line and doused it with the black wash and pulled some of it away with a paper towel, and this will act as the rope for the swing. For the seat, I grabbed a very small piece of craft wood and split it to the size of a swing seat. Now, trying to adhere all of this tiny stuff on a tree was an absolute pain, and at one point got my fingers pretty stuck together with the super glue I was using. But at the end of the day, it was worth it, and it was a fun little thing I loved adding to the build. With the swing complete, let's look at some awesome glamour shots. Well, there you have it, folks, my take on some gnarly dead trees that you can use in your tabletop games. I hope you all enjoyed the build, and I have plans of doing some other fun ones in the future. I also want to give a big thanks to my buddy Leif from Devs and Dice. He gave me a few pointers during this build, and if it wasn't for his awesome terrain builds, I would not have been inspired to tackle this project. So if you haven't already, go check out his channel. Also, since you have made it this far in the video, feel free to subscribe, check out the Patreon, and do all of the other socials. Until next time, folks, I want to thank you all for watching, and of course, happy gaming.